Hey everyone, and welcome to this special Soapbox edition of the Risky Business Podcast. My name's Patrick Gray. If you're looking for one of the weekly news-focused editions of Risky Biz, do scroll one back in your podcast feed. These Soapbox podcasts are a wholly sponsored podcast series we do here at Risky Biz HQ that we run, I'm going to say, about once a month. And the idea is we get vendors, we get sponsors in to talk about their tech, the way they view things, pretty much anything really, as long as it's interesting. And this edition of the Soapbox is brought to you by VMRay. VMRay makes a sandbox technology that originally found a market with people working in DFIR. These days, however, VMRay is offering its solution both to analysts and as a technology you can integrate as a general security protection. You can plumb their sandbox through, to your web proxy or your mail gateway, use it to spot nasties, and as a nice side benefit, it'll also spit out a bunch of useful threat intel for you. Anyway, you're about to hear an interview between myself and the two founders of VMRay. It's CEO Carsten Willems and CTO Ralf Hund. And yeah, basically we go back and look at a brief history of sandbox tech, and we include in that history the abridged version of the rise and fall of FireEye's sandbox tech as a meaningful protection. And yeah, I'm going to drop you in here where Ralf is talking about early sandbox technology. And here he is.
One of the early technologies that were used, especially during the early sandboxes and also academic days, are emulation-based sandboxes. So in that case, you completely, fully emulate the entire system, meaning that every CPU instruction or every memory read or write would be logged by the system. This gives you plenty of data, like you have tons of different operations that you can theoretically use to create a report on it and also base a verdict on it in the end. That's the one thing. It's been used very often in academic projects, as I said, because their performance doesn't really play too much of a role. Yeah, it doesn't really matter if the analysis takes very long. It could take several hours even. Whereas in a productive environment where you, for example, want to protect your emails using some sort of sandbox, you cannot just block the email for several hours. It just doesn't work. So for that reasons, people built another technology, which is called hooking. So in that case, you basically have a detonation environment in which you install some sort of monitoring engine that tries to intercept interesting behavior of the sample that you're analyzing. So, for example, API calls, system calls.
Messing around with the registry, that sort of stuff.
Exactly, yeah. So every time, like create file, which is the Windows API for creating a file, obviously it would be called, and that would be intercepted, and you can log it, and in the end you can base your report on it. That's basically hooking. It has the advantage that you can run it. Usually you run it inside a virtual machine. You can even run it on a real computer without any virtualization, but usually you would do it in a virtual machine. And it's much faster, obviously, because most of the system can just run normally. You don't have to emulate it. You don't get as much granularity in terms of the results out of it, but it's much faster, and therefore it's pretty much being used in most of the at least commercial systems that we know these days. Like Cuckoo is a very, very well-known open source system that uses exactly this approach. And from that, basically, we have built a third technology, which is used hypervisor-based sandboxing. And in that case, you do not have any software running inside a detonation environment, because that's the obvious disadvantage of hooking, that you have to fiddle with the detonation environment. And very often the monitoring engine, it even runs on the same permission level as the sample that is being analyzed. So the sample can detect it, or it can even kind of fool the monitoring engine. And that's not possible if you're basically completely on the outside and you're looking on it from the outside, and there's some hypervisor CPU enforced permission system between you and the sample. And that's what we did.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about what it is that you actually did. I mean, I understand one of the primary objectives of building the sandbox the way you did was to avoid malware being able to detect that it was actually in a sandboxed environment, right? Because this is one of the things, like sandboxing, early commercial sandboxes I mean, okay, so FireEye, right, is the obvious example because they built themselves a simple appliance that would take mail attachments and execute them and whatever. And, it was really good. It was really effective until a lot of people started using it, and then people figured out that bypassing it was not actually that difficult. I mean, that's my reading of the FireEye story, essentially. But that might be a bit harsh. What do you think, Ralf?
Yeah, I agree with it. I mean, that was part of this ongoing cat and mouse game that we all play all the time. And sandboxing, I mean, it was used by FireEye and also by other vendors to provide ATD, so to be able to detect unknown malware. Let's just say it like this. I mean, essentially, they were trying to detect unknown malware, which went pretty well until, as you said, obviously malware authors, they are aware that these systems exist, so they came up with tons of different evasion techniques over the last years. And
Well, I mean, why don't we talk through those evasion techniques? Because one of the critical mistakes I make on this show is that I assume, everyone who's listening to these podcasts has been in the industry for 20 years and, actually knows the history here, and they might not because it's been a little while. Why don't you walk us through like some of the rudimentary ways that people could actually get around these less sophisticated sandboxes?
I would say there are basically three different categories of sandbox evasion. So the first one is obviously just detecting that you're in a sandbox. So that would mean, for example, in the very early days of sandbox evasion, malware tried to detect whether it's running in a virtualized system. So assumption was that if you're in a VM, then you just don't affect the system because VMs are being used by malware by people who want to analyze malware, by sandboxes and so on and so forth.
And there were some pretty simple tests you could do in like shellcode and whatnot to detect whether or not you were in a sandbox environment. Why don't you tell people like what some of those techniques were?
Yeah, you could execute certain instructions. I mean, there was this blue pill, red pill thing in the very early days where you could
Joanna Redkowska. It was very interesting. Yes.
Exactly. You could execute a certain instruction and then you would get back a memory pointer which is used in the memory mapping system. And if it has a certain value, so okay, this is now a virtualized system because VMware or VirtualBox or whatever is behind would use that. So there were kind of a couple of direct detections. Of course, in a VM, you also emulate certain devices, like you have a certain graphics card that's being emulated or a certain network card that's being emulated, and you can just also crawl the registry to see whether this is a particular emulated device, for example. That's one approach. Another one would be timing detections, like because the hypervisor also introduces some overhead, you can execute certain instructions and in a hypervisor, in a virtualized system, they take longer than on a real system, and you can measure that. However, that usually doesn't work too reliable. Like, I'm still surprised that it's being used so much in malware. And very often, if let's say on your computer you have a lot of processes running and there's a lot of multitasking, then all of a sudden you would accidentally think that you're running on a virtual machine and not. So it's a bit funny because usually the sandbox tries to detect the malware. And in malware, sandbox evasion and in sandbox detection, it's just the other way around. So now, before that happens, the malware wants to detect the sandbox, and it has the same problems, such as false positives, false negatives, and so on. So,
and there were other generic techniques too, like just getting your malware to wait until a certain date to do anything, right? And something that simple was just such a generic approach. And, this is why we're talking about the arms race, because then the sandboxes started stepping these things through time, right? Like very rapidly to see if there was some sort of time delayed payload in there and whatnot. But yeah, and this is how the sandbox arms race was born, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they permanently come up with new ideas. Like you said, time bombs, you just sleep for a long time, or you just execute a lot of API calls in a loop in the initialization of your sample, like millions of API calls, which on a normal computer, it takes seconds. In the sandbox, it logs every API call, let's say, and then it just explodes. It takes hours until that goes through. On a real computer, it takes seconds and so on. And these are all things you need to cope with.
Yeah, I mean, I remember seeing a guy called Jonathan Brossard. I believe he's based in the United States. Last time I saw him, he was in the United States, but he lived in Australia for a long time, and he did a presentation on evading specifically FireEye stuff, and it was pretty, it was sort of a pretty funny talk, right? Like some of the ways that he got around this stuff and other ways where he could actually, because people had their gateways, like in some sensitive areas, he could actually just run his code in the FireEye sandbox, but he could get network connectivity because obviously they wanted to let samples be able to connect to the internet so that they could see if they were going to grab any, second stage payloads or anything like that. So from there, he would actually just start scanning for internal resources from their sandbox and, keep it alive long enough to be able to propagate his attack onwards. That was pretty cool. Hi, Jonathan, too, if you're listening. So you set out to solve some of these problems. I mean, where do you even begin when it comes to solving those problems and trying to build an undetectable sandbox?
Yeah, first of all, with the technology, that's the most important part, because if you don't have anything running inside the system, as I said, then you basically defeat these detection-based approaches. So because the most advanced attack or the worst attack against the sandbox is if it's just directly detected. Yeah, if you directly detect an artifact from the sandbox, you're inside the sandbox, and then that's it. It's game over. So that's the most important part, to be able to deal with that. The virtualization detection, so much you can deal with as well, also on the hypervisor part, but they're not as common anymore. And then for the other systems, you need to make sure you have a system that looks used as well. Yeah, that you have a detonation environment where you constantly create new files before the analysis, so that the malware doesn't think it's not running in on a real and used environment. And then for the other systems, time bombs, there are a lot of smart ways you can do it. You need to solve these challenges generically. I think that's the most important part. You need to generically be able to solve time bomb issues, because there are a lot of ways how you can measure times. You need to be fast as well. That's how you can counter these, let's say, mass API call issues. That's a very important part, because inside that limited time that you have during the detonation, you want to see as much behavior so that you can say that this is a malicious file or not.
Also joining us is Carsten Willems, who is the CEO and the other founder of VMRay. So, Carsten, do you have any, what do you think have been the most interesting developments in this sort of sandbox arms race in the time that you've been involved with this technology, which is quite a long time now? It's over a decade, right, since you've been into this stuff. Can you think of the particularly, what were the interesting challenges both for you and also for the people on the malware side?
Yeah, so I've been involved since, I think, the beginning, right? So in the mid of the 2000s, there was a situation when the massive amount of new malware came up every single day, and also the amount of protection and defensive layers that were built into the malware to make the analysis time-consuming and slow. That was the beginning of the time when we needed automation. We needed automated solutions. And you
needed dynamic analysis, right? You couldn't statically pull these things apart anymore. They were too obfuscated.
Yeah, that's true. Dynamic analysis also had been used earlier by the manual use of debuggers. Yeah, but of course, dynamic analysis adds a lot of context and makes reverse engineering easier. But in itself, it's not automated by itself. So we need automation. And on the one hand, we have these honeypots, which today are pretty famous under the name of deception. Yeah? Honeypots, automated systems to collect new malware. And for the analysis part, we came up with that concept of sandboxing, where the whole reverse engineering itself was to some extent automated. Yeah? So at the beginnings, sandboxes did not create a verdict. So it did not tell you if something is bad or not, but it was just an automated system where you could put an suspicious file into, and then after some time, you got a very detailed report, and then still a reverse engineer or a threat researcher was used to read that report, and from the report decide, hey, this is a dangerous file or it's not. And then FireEye came up with that idea of putting the whole sandbox into an appliance, and in addition to only creating analysis, also creating a verdict which you can base decisions on. So that was definitely one of the important turning points in how sandboxes have been used.
Yeah. Yeah. So, let's talk about the modern contemporary sandbox era. What are the challenges for you in terms of remaining hidden from malware authors, and have malware authors actually, I'm guessing at this point with where your company is, they probably haven't actually tried to bypass your kit specifically yet, have they?
I have not explicitly seen any threats doing that. Probably it's because we don't expose ourselves that much to the public. So we don't have a public service. We don't have a free solution that everybody can use, and which of course is also used a lot by the attackers. So as we see, for example, with Cuckoo or with some other providers who have that public interface. I mean, we did that earlier with other projects before, and we had been able to collect a lot of malware because authors use our public sandbox services to test their malware, make their malware more stealthy. So we could also generate intelligence from that, but with VMRay we don't go that route. So you mentioned how can it constantly remain hidden, and that's I think the most important point for recent sandbox usages. So nowadays, where sandbox technologies are used everywhere, both for standalone solutions but also integrated into other security tools like on the gateway level and so on, the force that you said, the post FireEye area. Now the malware actors, of course, have adapted. And I would say that at least 50% of the malware that I'm seeing today, the first thing it does before it actually executes its malicious payload, and by that reveals its true intention, is running all these different defensive measurements against sandboxes, against other security products and stuff like that. So the good side of Sandbox is that it's so effective, but the bad side is it's so effective that everybody's using it, and therefore everybody's also trying to attack it. Like with the FireEye, if FireEye had not been so successful, then not that many security researchers had tried to find holes within that system.
Yeah. So, but I mean, like, how would you go about attacking your sort of, VM-based approach, right? Like, what are the weaknesses? Like, let's talk straight up, because you will know what they are. Tell us.
I would love to write a tool to break VMRay. That would be really a challenge, yeah. But the point today, as Ralf also mentioned, is in the beginning, they tried to detect the sandbox technologies. Then they tried to detect, hey, is this really a used system? So are there some user artifacts like cookies and browser history and files that have been created by the user? Because usually you don't find that in a sandbox.
Yeah.
And even
that's
beyond that,
smart.
today,
that's smart. Yeah. If it looks like it's a clean install of Windows, right? No documents in the documents folder, no cookies, no bookmarks. Mm-hmm. That's a good thing to detect. It's a pretty smart generic way to detect that you're in a place that's not real. Hat tip to those attackers, right? Smart thinking.
Yeah. And there are 1 million places where you can look. There are 1 million locations in the registry, and if you really invest some time into research, you will find so many different differences between a freshly installed system that only lives for a few minutes with each life cycle or a real computer. So after attacking the technologies, then they tried to look to differentiate between a real system and a non-real system. And what we now see is more and more targeting. And it's not only that one government is attacking the other government, but we also see a lot of semi-targeting against specific organizations that is done by cybercrime and not by nation-state actors. So they look for, hey, is this really, what's the name of the email address? What's the network infrastructure? What's the software stack being installed? Is this a machine of the company XYZ? Is this the machine of the person XYZ, of the department XYZ? So they are more looking for not excluding sandboxes, but excluding the wrong environments, because all this automation also helped the attackers to automate semi-targeted attacks.
I mean, I'm not going to lie, that's impressive, right? Like, if I remember reading, Kim Zetter's book about what was it, Countdown to Zero Day, the Stuxnet book, where they spoke about Flame, which was very cool malware, and that's going back a while now. But you're talking about sort of similar approaches where you're not even going to see the real payload until it knows until it knows it's in the right place. That's pretty cool.
Exactly. And if I were malware, I would not just show an error message or not execute anything, but just execute something different. Yeah. So, I mean, showing an error message or not doing at all is very suspicious. Yeah. So, but if you can really conceal. And there are other malwares, for example, that decompose their payload into many, many small parts, and they use these parts and interweave that into large chunks of benign activity. So it's really hard to find it. And if you think about these machine learning-based systems, they always look for sequences, for n-grams, and for for activity that is spatially and timely located to each other. If you really span your payload over billions of benign data points, then it's really, really hard to create a model from that.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is cool, right? This is very interesting because I'm just wondering from your point of view, Ralf, maybe this is a good question for you. I mean, there's not really much you can do from a VMRay point of view, right? If the sample's just not going to even detonate in your environment, right? Because, you're not the intended target. It's intended for someone where they know the software stack on that machine looks like this. They know, they know enough about the targeted machine to be able to detect that they're on it. I mean, what can you do at that point? I mean, do you try to rapidly spin up different combinations of stacks or, try to emulate enough environments until something changes? Or is that just an area where you won't be able to do much?
It's a general shortcoming of dynamic analysis that you can only base your judgment on what is being executed. So it depends, on how that check would look like. If you really specifically look at very specific things, such as is the username of the system particular, very, very equal to one specific username, then of course it is hard. However, as Carsten said, it depends a bit on how it is being done as well. So we can see that somebody checks, let's say, the username of the system or the IP address or anything, any artifact. And then if afterwards you terminate a program or you don't do anything, you go into a loop that is at least, let's say, suspicious in a certain way. You couldn't say it's malicious. Some sandboxes do it, but I think this is just causes too many FPs because there are benign use cases for it. But you can just mark this as suspicious. Yeah, that's one point. I mean, there are other ideas at this point to use systems that would try to analyze the code of the malware like statically in combination with dynamic analysis.
I was actually just about to ask if that was an approach, but already I was just thinking that just sounds like it would just get a little bit unruly pretty quickly.
Yeah, there are a lot of academic systems who do that, and but it's a pretty tough problem. Yeah, it's the name academic in it. And commercially, it usually takes too long. I mean, in an ideal world, you combine both approaches at this point, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, it was really the Packers.
There's one additional thing how we can, and others try that as well. You said if a malware only detonates correctly in the expected environment, then it's important that you make the environment of your security solution to match the environment that you want to protect, right? So if you're just using a sandbox environment that always looks the same, then this helps not against targeted malware. But if you have the possibility to use your own golden image where all the software stack, all the settings are the same as in your company, then you have a higher chance for also detecting these targeted
you want your standard corporate build in your sandbox, I think is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Because that will get you past that first rudimentary check, won't it? But not so much by username. That's an interesting one. Do you see much of that? Because that is cool.
I mean, obviously, this can only be very targeted, so you can never see much of that. Yeah, so
I think it's more against Sandbox. I think I told that anecdote already. 15 years ago at the university in Mannheim, we had a large cluster of these new Sandbox systems, and one of our admins used the German term Hans Wurst, which is something like John Doe. He used it as a username for these machines. And even today, I see malware checking the username of the system for the value Hans Wurst, which was used 15 years ago in the university environment. Because one idiot malware writer copies the code from another idiot malware writer. But it proliferates. So it's not against, I think checking the username oftentimes is not for targeting, but for excluding sandbox systems. Yeah, they usually use the same username all the time.
Now, we have spoken a little bit, I guess, about the evolution of sandboxes and the corresponding evasion tricks of malware and whatnot. I mean, right now, there's one category of malware which is the most important category right now, and that is definitely ransomware. What does that look like? How does ransomware hold up against a sandbox? Because I'd imagine, this would be the easiest stuff to actually detect, right? Because of what it is trying to do. It would stick out like a sore thumb. And then you're back to worrying about some of the evasion techniques, like maybe time delays before, the ransomware would try to encrypt anything or whatnot. So, Carsten, why don't you tell me, over the last couple of years, how has VMRay held up against these ransomware samples that I'm sure you've seen a zillion of?
Yeah, it's just as you said. It's super easy to differentiate between. I mean, if you overcome the evasion layers, then ransomware is super easy to detect, and that is oftentimes a problem because there is no good or bad software, right? If you take a look at, let's say, the Skype installer. Skype installer creates persistency on your system. It eavesdrops on your microphone, on your camera. It performs encryption. There's it accepts incoming connections and so on and so forth. And it's the same with, let's say, an FTP server that you install on your machine, which we did a lot some time ago, right?
I remember many years ago, a friend of mine said he tried to firewall off Skype from being able to leave his corporate environment. And he said it would scramble around like a rat in a burning maze until it found a way out. You know, he's like, it was incredible to see this thing actually be able to find its way out. It would just keep trying different methods until it managed to actually, WebRTC or whatever and get the hell out of there. But anyway, sorry, continue.
Yeah, the point is, from the outside, very often a software that is doing some benign stuff, like TeamViewer, which I use to help my parents with their computers. TeamViewer is the same as a rat, like a rat Trojan. Yeah,
well,
exactly the same.
I remember the one that like Silence used to have trouble with mostly was gaming software, because it's full of like anti-cheat and everything's really obfuscated, and like that stuff looks like. That looks bad to a machine learning model. They're just like, no, do not run this, right? So it's funny the way that works out.
Yeah. So there's not good software and bad software. It's always about who is using the software for what intention, and therefore it's also important for Sandbox analysis that you add context. Yeah, where is this file coming from? How is it being used, and so on and so forth. So from the outside, it all looks the same. But there is not much benign software that looks like a ransomware, because I mean, probably TrueCrypt or some of these crypto stuff. But I mean, who's using that anymore? So for ransomware, it's pretty easy to detect, and therefore sandboxing is very effective against it. And then it's only back to the evasive and defensive layer. But this is the same with every single software. And it's funny that you mentioned games that Silence is having problem with, because all these copyright protection, they have the same defensive measures as malware, right?
Well, that's it. It's like anti-cheat, anti-reversing, any of that stuff. Yeah. I don't know that Silence still has problems with that. I mean, that was like 4 years ago when I had that conversation, because it was just with one of the senior execs there, and I'm like, well, what's a category of software that gives you a hard time? And they were just like rubbing their temples going, the entire gaming industry, basically. Yeah. So, I mean, when we think about contemporary ransomware, I'm guessing you just wait for the thing to start trying to go around and like encrypt all your files. I mean, that's going to stand out, right? Or is there some sort of commonality between different strains of ransomware that you can pick up on before it even gets that far?
I think it's a good point I mean, a sandbox, as Ralf said in the beginning, a sandbox is not the silver bullet. It's a great complementary technology to static analysis, also probably to machine learning-based detection methods. But the sandbox has a downside that it is dependent on seeing malicious activity. So if you only see a time bomb, or if you only see some arbitrary actions, you cannot base a decision on that. So you really need to trigger the malicious payload. And ransomware, I mean, yeah, some other things are happening sometimes, but the core functionality is the encryption of the hard disk. And therefore, we put a lot of effort in triggering the payload. We do that by fast forwarding in time. We do that by simulating user behavior, because very often malware just waits for the user to use the system by moving the mouse, clicking on buttons, doing things, rebooting the machine. So we try a lot in monitoring or in identifying that the malware is waiting for something, like a reboot, like a task that has been created that will be scheduled only in a few hours, or how the malware is waiting for certain triggers. And we are very good in detecting these triggers and then triggering them, right? So it's not that much about adding magic in order to predict what will happen in the future, but it's all about making the things that will happen in the future happen now, so we can see them.
So look, let's talk about how you've applied the sandbox. I mean, last time we spoke, Carsten, you were talking about essentially being able to plumb various bits of security gear or just IT gear, really, through to your service, right? So we're talking about proxies. Web proxies at the gateway, that sort of thing, mail gateways and whatnot. How is that going, right? Because it's been a while now since we had that conversation, and that was a new service. Like, have you got a bunch of partnerships in the works? I mean, can you say that you're popular in specific verticals? Like, how's that going?
The whole idea is of what we are doing, and the whole idea of our product strategy is to make our technology applicable to much more use cases. Because at the beginning, it was only used by incident response teams. Then people said, hey, give us something that we can use earlier on the infection chain, on the attack chain. So we started with our email solution, which can be added on top of other email gateways or other email security products, also be used with Office 365. And now we are close to finish our web proxy integration, and Ralf can talk definitely about that. And we also have the idea in the queue, we also have a cloud access security solution. So the overall scheme is to enable our customers, and it's the same type of customers as we had in the past, right? So it's all large enterprises. Yeah, we have an overweight into the finance sector, but
but they're the ones who buy security stuff. Like, let's be honest, right? Like, everybody is overweight on banking, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they buy the security stuff because
banks buy it because that's
really
where
important.
The money is,
yeah?
Like literally and figuratively. So yeah, I mean, that makes sense.
Exactly. So it's the same type of organization. But Ralf, probably you can talk more about the Icap integration and also the upcoming cloud solution.
Yeah, tell us about the cloud solution. Like, we did talk about Icap integration last time, right? So I'm guessing that's well and truly done. What's the cloud solution look like? I'm guessing that's just some sort of API-based thing.
Yeah, the idea is to integrate into the APIs. That's usually the way you can go these days, because in cloud solutions, every cloud solution provides some REST API that you can integrate with, for example, on Office 365 to integrate with the different services, Mail Exchange, SharePoint, and so on and so forth. And with that system, you can integrate into the APIs. You can receive notifications as soon as files are being uploaded on that particular system, if it's a storage system, and then you can scan it, and then we can protect it, and we can move the file to a junk folder, for example, if we see that it is detected as malicious, or we can somehow mark it as spam. That's basically how it works.
Now, Carsten, I understand, one thing that you're, pretty happy about is that you've built a web engine which, you can feed it URLs and it'll go out and, have a look for credfish and, malicious payload, stuff like that. That's right, yeah?
So in the beginning, malware was mostly used or executables. Then it was Office files with all these exploits that were targeting vulnerabilities in Acrobat Reader, vulnerabilities in Flash, vulnerabilities in Office. Then in the 2010s, people stopped using precious exploits, but they just used macros because it was so easy to break out of the Office files, and they started using script languages and stuff like that. And today we see still a shift where malware is no longer really sent by email as an attachment, but it's always an embedded link somewhere which takes you to a website, and that website then also needs to be analyzed in order to automate everything to really get the second stage, the third stage of the malware, or to come to the point where you can identify, hey, this is a phishing website, this is credential stealing, this is something. So in addition to detonating files and detonating documents, we also added more of our own technologies to detonate URLs. So this sounds trivial because detonating URLs had been done for quite a long time in Sandboxes, but to really make that efficient and applicable and not detonating the wrong URL so that you subscribe to 1 million newsletters or you trigger some activities that are hidden behind links. Yeah, this is a sophisticated task, and we really invested into that web engine. So it's a good piece of technology that complements our Sandbox stuff.
Okay, Ralf Hund and Carsten Willems, thank you so much for joining me on this Soapbox edition of the program, the last one for 2020, to talk about, Sandboxes. That's our regular Sandbox chat. Happens once a year. It's always a lot of fun. I wish you a great holiday period, and we'll be catching up with you again next year. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Patrick.
Thanks for having us.
That was Ralf Hund and Carsten Willems of VMRay there, and you can check them out at VMRay.com. And that is it for this edition of the Soapbox. I'll be back in a couple of days with another weekly show, but until then, I've been Patrick Gray. Thanks for listening.